An Auckland father is facing a long, slow recovery after contracting measles and then encephalitis from a person he came into contact with for less than 2 minutes. 45-year-old Nick Penney thought he was vaccinated against the highly contagious disease, but caught measles last month and quickly developed potentially fatal swelling of the brain. He's now recovering at home, but his wife, Nicci Gillies, told me his diagnosis should act as a warning for others to check their immunity.
At the moment, Nick spends about 80% of his day in a very subdued environment, and any interaction or actions on his behalf really drain him, and he gets really quite disturbed and uncomfortable in his body. So we're just keeping him very low-key stimulation around him. And then we're just walking towards the rehab now.
Nicci, can we go back a step? Do you know exactly where your husband caught the measles?
I do. Yeah, I do. I do know where Nick contracted measles. There's potential for 2 exposures. The first was the period of around 2 hours, but that in a timeline doesn't work out. The second time that he was exposed, it was around a minute that he was in the situation with the person that was contagious at the time. And of our entire family, he was there for the least amount of time. And we left that situation to find out the next morning that that person had developed the measles rash, and then they were confirmed as a measles case. And then it was exactly 9 days from that minute exposure that Nick himself developed the initial stages of measles.
So just so I'm understanding this correctly, he just wandered into a room with a person who has measles, was in there for about 60 seconds, and that was all it took?
Slightly more probably than 60. He did kiss the person on the cheek and then left, but it was very, very intermittent, and he left very quickly. But yes, that was the level of his exposure.
Can you talk us through how things unfolded from that point?
So for the next 9 days, everything was fine. The onset was quite quick. We had friends over for lunch, and at the end of the lunch, he just said, I need to go to bed, I'm not well. That was the Sunday, the Monday, and the Tuesday. He has a work from home situation, so he worked both of those days, and then again on the Wednesday, but it was only part hours at that stage. And then he signed off from his work computer on the Wednesday, and then that was the last that his work heard from him. And then the next thing, I was messaging them to let them know that he was in Auckland Hospital.
And at the point you went to Auckland Hospital, what prompted that?
Nick's breathing had become really laboured on the Saturday evening. His temperature was around 40 to 41 degrees, and he was quite disassociated from what was happening. And I rang Healthline, and they sort of talked me through what they thought could be potentially happening, and then we activated an ambulance. And the ambulance staff came and took him to the hospital.
When he was in hospital and he developed this swelling on the brain, can you remember the doctors telling you what was happening?
There's 2 phases to his hospitalisation. So Nick's behaviour had become quite unusual from probably around Thursday, and it was very, very difficult to connect with him and for him to allow me or our children any form of support for him. And that was quite extraordinary for us. It was a bit of a battle to get fluids into him. When we got to the hospital on the Saturday evening, I wasn't allowed to see him. They had decided that because they believed at that stage he was immunised. Because we were immunised, our entire family had to go into quarantine. So I left the hospital to put the family into quarantine, and then we got more information the next day that said, no, in fact, Nick wasn't immunised, and it was very obvious that he was unimmunised from the severity of his infection that we were able to visit. And so when I returned to the hospital, he was in a very unusual state, and there was cross-communication within the ward that he was being housed in. It's part medical, part infectious disease. And the infectious disease doctors came through and said, you're no longer contagious, and we can discharge you. And that was all Nick was wanting to have happen. And he was discharged and under a protocol that he needed to drink 3 litres of water, take his antibiotics for the secondary infections and Panadol for the pain. And I just said he's not coming home with me because it was just not a person that I knew. And his mother came in to support and took him home. And then she was the one that ran the ambulance again that evening. Because he had become quite delirious, and that's when I arrived at Auckland Hospital at 1 o'clock in the morning, and Nick was having a CT scan and then a lumbar puncture, and he was diagnosed with measles and encephalitis.
That must have been pretty scary stuff.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever stood outside a room with a young doctor who was telling me, I've never had the experience of being told that there was no treatment, and this is what the doctors are trying to prevent from happening in New Zealand in this epidemic, that once we get to this place, they can't do anything, and that's why they're wanting people to immunise and find out about their immunisation status, and that it is potentially fatal.
So what did they tell you about your husband's prospects at that stage? What were they saying to you?
They didn't say anything. Like, it was more we needed to wait, and we would hydrate him, and we would keep his pain under management. And then it was just waiting to see how everything would go.
So your husband, how would you describe him normally? Is he active, healthy?
Nick is a really, really fit guy. He is healthy, eats really well, exercises, he coaches a couple of football teams. He's, very active in his life.
And how did that compare to him at the height of this infection?
That person wasn't there. Like, that person was not there at all.
How worried were you for him?
I was very worried. I try to have a mindset where I'm just seeing the positive, the other side of where we are, and I tried to keep that in the forefront while we were going through it, and then holding that for our family, holding that for our children.
But the effects of him having the measles are not over just because he's out of hospital.
We're no longer dealing with the measles. We're dealing with brain injury from the measles. So there is encephalitis, brain swelling, that happens for different reasons, for different viral reasons for people. This is measles encephalitis, so this is a byproduct of the measles. And this is just something that the public aren't necessarily aware of.
So your husband had never been immunised as far as you know?
No.
And at the time he got
Yes.
measles, did you know that, was he aware that he had no immunity?
No, he didn't. He believed he was immunised.
Nicci Gillies speaking to us there about her husband, Nick Penney, who contracted measles.